So for block 2, we are going to do foundation paper piecing. I'm going to do it in the regular sort of traditional way, and then the next time we do foundation piecing, we'll use a different method. So for this method, you're going to need your fabric pieces. I have pre-cut mine into rectangles. If you've got tinier pieces, you can use those, but I will show you a bit more about this once we get started with the pattern. I need a good pair of paper scissors. Don't use your nice fabric scissors. Use paper scissors to cut out the template. You can use either washi tape or glue. This is just to prep the paper template. You're going to need a nice sharp rotary cutter and then a ruler with a 1/4 inch marking on it. So just a regular ruler like this one, or you can also use, this is specifically made for foundation piecing. This is the add 1/4 ruler, and it has a little edge on it that you can use to bump up against the paper when you're trimming your seams. I'll show you how both work. You don't have to have this add 1/4 ruler, but if you do a lot of foundation piecing, they really are very cool. The first step in this block is to print out the pieces and put them all together so that we can sew onto them, okay? So I've already put this one together. This is section 1. And what I've done also is write down the colors so that when I get to the point where I'm sewing fabric on here, I don't have to remind myself, what is fabric 1, what is fabric 3. So there's the section 1. Section 2, I'll just show you how I put this together. When I cut these out, I provide this little extra piece of paper here, and that's just so you can use glue or a piece of tape. I'm just going to put a bit of glue on there. Set this right along here. Get it lined up. Okay, there, give that a minute. If you were using tape, you could fold this down here and just add some, I like washi tape because it's nice and thin. So you could add tape on the back instead of using glue, whatever you have handy, okay? So the first step in this process is to fold along all the lines, okay? We're just going to crease on every sew line. So I'm folding over, giving it a good crease. If you don't want to use, if you have nice nails, you could use a ruler, run the ruler along here. And we're just folding it back and forth. Okay, do the next section. I'm going right edge to edge. Don't worry about that seam allowance. Okay, and this will do a few things. It allows you, makes it easier to fold the paper back when you need to see where you're putting your papers or your fabrics. And it allows you to fold back to trim the seam allowances, and it makes it easier to tear the papers out when you're all done sewing the fabrics to the paper, because the paper is just acting as a temporary foundation, hence the name foundation paper piecing. The paper doesn't stay in, we sew onto it, and then we're going to tear the papers off when we're all done. Okay, so you'll do the same thing with the other section, and then we will talk about sewing the fabric onto the papers. The funky thing about foundation paper piecing is that we are sewing the fabric onto the back of these papers. So we will be adding fabric on this side. That way we can see what we need to do on this side. Okay, we have our templates folded. I've done some drawing on here for you. And now we're ready to add fabric. The first piece that goes on, we're sewing on the back of this fabric, right? And the very first piece that goes on in a section should be facing out. So pretty side facing towards you. And that piece needs to cover this whole first shape, right? It needs to cover the seam allowance on these two sides, but it also needs to cover a seam allowance on this side. So you can see this line is where we're stitching, but here is, I've drawn it, sketched it out roughly where your 1/4 inch seam allowance would be. So I need this piece of fabric to cover this whole shape. You don't want it sticking like this. because you're not covering the shape. You don't want it to stick out like this. You're not getting the whole shape. It's gotta go just like that, okay? Temporarily hold this in place just with a pin. All right, now I'm gonna fold it back over. We'll do it upside down because it makes the most sense. We're next adding number 2, which is a pink piece of fabric. This pink piece of fabric needs to cover this whole triangle plus the seam allowance all the way around this triangle, right? So I already know this is a huge piece of fabric for this, but I know that it's going to cover this piece. So I need to fold my paper back. There's the shape that I need to cover. And I'm going to put this pretty side facing my first fabric. From now on, for the rest of this template, it'll be pretty side facing in, okay? The very first one, facing, pretty side facing towards you. The rest of them, pretty side facing in. You can see there's enough fabric to cover that side of the shape. It's covering the seam allowance here. And if I were to fold this back, I can see that it's covering, there's plenty, right? Plenty. So now I'm going to take this, I'm going to fold it over. And I might even lift this up and pull this pin out. I'm going to pin these 2 pieces of fabric just temporarily because we are going to sew along this printed line, the line that we folded on. We're going to sew right along there. Okay, I have my machine all set up and ready to go. There are a couple things you want to do before you start. Number 1, you need to make sure you have a flat foot on here. Previously, I was sewing on here with a flanged foot, so I took that off. I've got my regular foot on here now. And secondly, you want to drop your stitch length down to 1.8. And another thing I'll mention is thread. I use a really fine thread called Deco Bob by Wonderfil. It's an 80 weight thread, but if you've got 40 or 50 weight thread, that's fine as well. But a fine thread will help reduce the bulk in your seams. All right, now I have my template here and I've got my 2 fabrics. They're still being held in place just with a pin, and I'm going to sew, not on this scratchy, messy line. I'm going to sew right from the edge over the seam allowance all along, right on that printed line. So I'll drop my needle. There's no need to do a lock stitch at the beginning and end. You don't have to do anything. You just stitch along right on the line. Just pull this gently out. So we've sewn right along the edge, and you're probably looking at it and going, this is so weird, what the heck is going on? So we can take it over to the table and I'll show you. This looks funky, but if you've done it like this, it's correct, okay? All right. We're back at the cutting table, and before we do anything else, we need to do some trimming. So we've just sewn all the way along this first line, and now we need to trim the seam allowance before we iron anything, okay? So I'm going to take this, I'm going to fold back this whole section because this is the seam allowance we need to trim. And I know I've got a lot of fabric here, so if you're an experienced foundation piecer, you would be able to, you know, cut some more responsible sized pieces, but I wanted to make it a bit easier for those who are new to the process. So I've got to trim all of this off, but I need to trim 1/4 inch away from the paper, right? So if I'm using a regular ruler, I'm just laying it down with 1/4 inch away from the paper. Or if I've got the add 1/4 ruler, there's this little edge on it. I flip it upside down and I'm going to put that edge, bump it up against the paper, and that gives us 1/4 inch. And I'm going to trim away all this excess. right? Like this. And then I'll fold this piece down. Okay? And then I'm just going to iron it in place. So you're not doing anything with the seams. You don't have to iron them open or anything. You're always just ironing it down towards the next piece. All right, so I'm going to iron this and then I'll show you how to add the third piece. Okay, I've ironed this down. I use a hot iron, no steam required. Okay, just takes a second to press that. And now we're going to add the third triangle. So the third triangle is here, but I'm working my way along this way, so it's easier for me to hold it like this, upside down. Here's our third triangle. And again, it's a white piece of fabric. Here's a white piece of fabric. It's totally big enough, more than big enough to cover this triangle, okay? So this triangle now gets folded down because we will be sewing it along here. When you fold this down, number one, you might have to do a little tear just along where that seam allowance is. That's fine, just tear the paper a little bit to be able to fold it. Okay, and the other thing is this is all seam allowance, this is all excess. So you can leave it as is and then try to place your fabric and make sure it's covering this shape now that it's folded, right? Or you can make it a little easier on yourself. If you've got a big hunk of fabric here, you can just trim this down to the seam allowance, 1/4 of an inch away from the folded paper, like this, okay? And now, this is number 3. I'm going to fold it, like I said. I'm going to put pretty side facing pretty side. So, pretty sides together. And this is the triangle. We're trying to make sure we have enough fabric covering the whole thing, like so, okay? And now, I'm going to flip it again, back like this. And we're going to stitch along this line. Before I do that, I'm going to take a pin and just pin everything into place. All right, so now I should only have 2 pieces of fabric here. I should have the white one touching the pink one, pretty sides together. I should be making sure that when this is folded over, you can hold it up to the light if you need to, but this triangle here is fully covered by that white fabric underneath. Another way to do it would be to take this, because we folded our fabric, just fold it back and see, yeah, there's lots of white back there. There's lots of white along here. There's enough to cover the seam allowance. So now we'll fold this and stitch along the printed folded line again. All right, here we go. Okay, our machine is ready. We've got our template here and we're going to sew. We've already sewn this first one. Now we're sewing along here, right along that folded line. I will drop my foot down and start from just before the paper, right? Or just right from the edge of the paper. Pull that out of our machine, and then we'll go back to the table, trim our seam allowance, and then iron again. All right, let's see it. We've added the third triangle here. There it is right there. Before we fold this back, we want to trim off this excess. So we're going to fold this back. The pink we already pre-trimmed, right? The white we haven't trimmed, to 1/4 of an inch away from the paper. Take that away, flip it. And now this has got a nice 1/4 inch seam allowance, and now I can iron this piece back and it fully covers that triangle. Okay, and then we just continue on all the way down this template, and then we do the second template the same way. let's go back a second time just for fun, because I've got the template ready, and let's do it from the top, okay? This time we're starting down at the bottom, okay? Sewing order 1 is blue, and it's a smaller blue piece because it's like a half triangle, right? Okay. And again, for this very first piece, pretty side faces out towards you, and it needs to cover the whole shape, including the seam allowance all the way around the shape. So I'm going to take this, and you know what, just for fun this time, rather than using a pin, I'll hold it in place just with a little streak of glue, but not too much. Okay, there's piece 1. Okay, so we have our blue piece just glued on temporarily, and now we're doing piece 2. And so it's black. We're going to fold this over like this, and pretty side facing up. It's going to face the blue, pretty side to pretty side. And what I'm trying to do now is get this shape, this big triangle here, to fit on the black fabric, and to check and make sure that there's enough black fabric all the way around the shape. Yes, it's a nice big piece, okay? Now I'm going to fold it back over, and we're going to stitch along this line. But to hold the 2 pieces together, hold them in place temporarily, I'm going to put a pin in. 1 pin, I'll put 2 pins in. All right, and we're going to stitch along here all the way from the edge of the paper to the edge of the paper. Back at the machine, I have my first 2 pieces together. I'm going to drop my foot and sew right from the edge of the paper. All the way to the end, pull this out, and then we'll take it back to the cutting table to trim before we iron. We have the 2 pieces sewn together. We've sewn all the way along here. Before we do anything else, we want to trim the seam allowance, that is where we just sewed, right? So we will take this, fold the whole thing back. This is all excess fabric. We're going to trim 1/4 of an inch away from the paper. All right. Okay, so we've trimmed the seam allowance, and now we can unfold it like this. Everything is folded open like this, right? And now we can fold this piece of fabric down here. You can see it's covering this triangle entirely, which is great. You don't have to do any trimming along the edges, like these outer seam allowances, until you've got the whole section done, right? So you're only trimming where you sew along these triangles. We'll be continuing on adding the fabrics 1 by 1 down each panel. Then we're going to trim around the panels, leaving this seam allowance on all sides. And then we'll sew the 2 panels together to make the block. I know it looks funky right now, but it's going to look amazing when we're done, okay? Once you get these 2 panels completed, I've got all my pieces sewn on this one, all my pieces sewn on this one. Now we need to trim all the way around, and you can do that with a ruler and a rotary cutter. And I'm leaving all the paper on, including this 1/4 inch seam allowance, all the way around, because we need to sew the 2 halves together. We've trimmed this up really nicely. It looks like this. This is what I love about foundation piecing. Look how nice these points are. Ooh, very nice, very fancy. Okay, so there's one. We'll repeat the process with this one, and then we're just going to sew the 2 halves together. Okay, I've got my 2 panels trimmed up, and now I can sew them together. I'm going to leave the papers in for now, and then I'll tear them out once I've got them sewn together. Which way should I do it? Because look, they're actually different combinations. I could do it this way. I could do it this way. I don't know. I think I like pink and black together. So this is how I'm going to do this. And we're just going to put these together, and I will add some pins to keep everything in place. So one of the tricks I like to use for this, I'll zoom in, whoop. See this is a nice point right here, and I want it to line up with the point underneath. So I will fold this back and just get those points lined up. See, you can see, whoop, right? Now it's going to get kind of thick because we've got paper and seams and a few layers of fabric, but once we get the paper out, it won't feel so bulky. All right, let's sew along. I'm not going to show you my sewing, but I'm just sewing right from the edge, 1/4 inch, and then we'll start tearing out the papers. Yes. I sewed the 2 halves together. Let's open it up. Boop, 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 boop. That looks pretty cool. I wasn't super careful. I almost lost a point down here, but I don't care. I don't care. I think it looks cool. I wasn't too worried about having perfect points, but the nice thing about foundation piecing is that you do get these really nice slick points. Now we're going to tear out the papers. Doing this is pretty easy, and I find it satisfying. Because we use the 1.8 stitch length, and because we already folded our papers back and forth, which makes the paper a little less stiff, it's pretty easy to just tear. And you're just going to tear carefully, like so. Another option, if it's giving you trouble, is to use a little bit of water and a Q-tip and just run it right along those seams. But I've never really had an issue with this, with doing it this way. Okay, tearing gently, especially when you get started. You don't want to pull on the stitches too much. Okay, and then you can see now I've got this little seam allowance piece here. Pull that out. And if you do end up with any little pieces like this, you can always use use some tweezers to just pull that out. The perfection in the seams is worth the effort. I hope you had fun with this. If you've got questions, and I'm sure you do, because foundation piecing is kind of funky, pop your questions in the comments below. Either I will answer them or someone else with foundation piecing experience will help you out. Okay, and obviously we've got another check-in for this block, so if you've got questions, you can also ask during the big sew day. I should mention, in the next block that we do that's foundation pieced, we won't be sewing through the paper. We're going to use a different technique, and so you won't have to do this step at all. It's a pretty cool technique, but I wanted to show you the traditional way first, especially for those of you who are new to this whole process. Okay, so we're building our skills. We're starting with this technique, and then we'll work our way up to an even easier technique where you're not sewing through the paper. Ooh, interesting. All right, over and out. Keep tearing the papers. I'll see you in the squad. Bye.